Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life Telos as First Principle. My name is Michael Dwan Herrick, and I'm a psychotherapist and life coach in private practice in London. Today, I want to talk about parenting, not from the perspective of a particular method or style, but from the deeper perspective of life itself. Specifically, through the lens of Life Telos, the natural direction and structure of life that shapes our needs, our behaviors, and our relationships. Apart from survival and reproduction, parenting is at the top of the list of functions that serve life. And as with so much else in modern life, things have changed, become more complex, and drifted away from the context that once supported parenting. Across the animal kingdom, we see parents protecting, feeding, guiding, and even teaching their young life skills. But human parents have much more to do. Our children are born unfinished. They're born utterly dependent and remain so for many years, not just for food and shelter, but for emotional support, socialization, and the transmission of an increasingly complex culture. We're now in the age of extended adolescence. Maybe you've heard of that. Due to many factors, but primarily economic, children now often remain dependent and live with their parents well into their 30s. As parents, we don't just feed and shelter our children and impart functional skills. We try to raise autonomous, emotionally stable meaning makers. We shape how our children feel, how they think, how they relate, and what they value. Parenting in humans is not just about survival. It's about a broader orientation to life. And, as already said, life has become increasingly complex, changeable, and confusing. For most of our evolutionary history, parenting happened within small, tight-knit groups. Parents were surrounded by grandparents, siblings, cousins, friends, and there was a village. That old African saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," it's true. It states a practical reality. Life was once simpler and more predictable. Adult roles were more prescribed and could be modeled by sheer proximity, by watching one's parents and other adults doing the things that a child would be expected to do as an adult. Traditionally, this included gendered roles for parents, perhaps more rigidly than we now believe is necessary, but they were complementary. One parent might nurture while the other challenged. One created safety, the other structure. Modern culture has often flattened these roles in the name of gender equality, sometimes for good reason, but sometimes at the cost of neglecting one or the other. Add to this the growing number of fatherless homes and its serious consequences for children, and we begin to see gaps in the provision of children's developmental needs. Children learn to regulate themselves emotionally and behaviorally by being regulated by adults. That's part of what secure attachment does. It co-regulates, models, and scaffolds a child's development. First, a parent needs to protect, support, and comfort their child. This has traditionally been the maternal role. Because this has been more widely understood, there's often a fear of correcting a child's behavior, as if correction might cause trauma, and many parents are paralyzed by the fear of harming their child. But children also need challenges and limits that will inevitably cause frustration. This is also part of development, which has traditionally been the paternal role. Ideally, a child will receive a good blend of both support and challenge, regardless of which parent is supplying it. I'm proposing that this is a general principle for parenting, not a prescription for exactly how to do it. I think another part of parenting is being a guardian of play. In most mammals, especially in intelligent social species, play is how young learn to navigate the world. It's rehearsal for real life, emotionally, socially, cognitively, and physically. Animals instinctively allow it by creating safe environments where offspring can roughhouse, explore, and invent within tolerable bounds. Likewise, in earlier human cultures, especially in tribal and small band societies, children were granted long stretches of unstructured play, often outdoors and among mixed age groups. with minimal adult interference. It was how children learned both independence and interdependence, how they grew into their place in the tribe. Schools now fill the day, not just with academic learning, but with hours of homework and structured extracurriculars. There's less time and less space to simply be a kid and play. On top of that, more recently, digital devices have absorbed much of what once happened through embodied play, like movement, imagination, conflict resolution, and the sheer physicality of interacting with the real world. Even toys have changed. Instead of a few open-ended objects that spark creativity, children are surrounded by a sea of commercialized, disposable playthings. They're fleetingly entertaining, but don't spark imagination or invention. So guarding our children's play, both in space and time, is another important parenting principle. And in today's culture, doing that often requires conscious resistance, saying no to overscheduling, creating screen-free spaces, and honoring boredom as a birthplace of creativity. I think we also need to be discerning about what toys and playthings we provide and not swamp our children with what I would call junk toys, as bad for their minds as junk food is for their bodies. This may all be good general advice. Maybe you agree with me. But now I want to take a giant step back and consider parenting from a historical perspective. There are reasons why these basic principles of parenting have been so hard to practice. To understand this, we need to look at the larger cultural and historical shifts that have changed its very structure. For most of human history, parents raised children in the context of tight-knit communities, often rural, often multi-generational, and deeply relational. Parenting was not an isolated job. It was embedded within a network of kin, neighbors, shared norms, and predictable roles. Children were part of everyday life, involved in work, learning through apprenticeship and observation. There were hardships, sure, but there was structure, there was continuity, there was coherence. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and everything began to change. It began in Britain in the late 1700s and gradually spread to other parts of the world. At first, the changes were modest, but over time, they reshaped nearly every aspect of life, including how children were raised. As adults left home for factory work, parenting roles began to split. Extended families broke apart as people migrated to cities. What had once been a communal task embedded in daily survival became more isolated, more pressured, and more uncertain. These changes didn't happen all at once, but by the early to mid-19th century, they'd have accelerated to the point that family life and the task of parenting was being transformed in ways we're still living with today. Increasingly, people were drawn from villages and farms into urban centers in search of work. This wasn't just a massive demographic shift, it was a relational one. The extended family system fractured. Generations were no longer living under the same roof. The web of shared parenting frayed. Although cities existed long before this, the scale and nature of industrial urbanization was unprecedented. Communities became more crowded, more transient, more anonymous. The daily rhythms of life changed. Parents began working long hours in factories. Children, instead of learning by participating in the rhythms of home and village life, were often pulled into the labor force themselves, sometimes in brutal conditions. Eventually, this exploitation led to public outcry. Child labor laws were introduced and mandatory public education emerged, removing children from factories and placing them in schools. This was a cultural shift based on concern for child welfare, but it also meant that parenting was further outsourced and redefined. The role of the parent diminished in scope, and the role of the institution grew. In the early 20th century, these trends were further accelerated by two world wars. Families were separated, fathers were drafted, many never returned, mothers entered the workforce in large numbers, and many children grew up in disrupted or traumatized households. The wars were not just political events, they were psychological earthquakes, shattering the patterns of family life and deepening the loss of intergenerational continuity. And let's not forget the automobile. It brought mobility and independence, but it also contributed to the fragmentation of extended families. With cars and highways came suburbs, geographic separation, and increased isolation. No longer did generations live close together. Parents and children became more alone in their day-to-day lives. The support of the village was now miles away. And all of this was taking place alongside a growing cultural emphasis on individualism, a story in which each person and each family was now expected to figure it out on their own. The modern nuclear family became idealized, but also pathologized if it didn't succeed. And without the inherited cultural frameworks of how to raise a child, parents began looking elsewhere for guidance. Enter the parenting experts. That loss of embeddedness didn't just make parenting harder, it left parents vulnerable to a new kind of influence, expert advice. In the early 20th century, parenting moved from the realm of culture and familial transmission to the realm of science. Experts like John B. Watson discouraged affection and advocated regimented control. Later, Dr. Spock flipped this, urging permissiveness and parental sensitivity. And with the rise of psychological science and child development research, parenting began to be shaped by theory. The 20th century brought us Freud, Bowlby, Piaget, Erikson, Winnicott, Skinner, and countless books, manuals, and opinions about what children needed. The goal was to help, and much of it did. But it also ushered in an era where parents were no longer drawing from evolutionary intuition and generational wisdom. They were drawing from professionals. It also raised the expectations for what parenting must provide. The cultural message became clear. Parenting is something you must learn from experts. It's not something transmitted through generations. And if you don't learn it right, your child could suffer for life. This new awareness of attachment, emotional regulation, and developmental needs was an extraordinary advance in human self-understanding. But it also introduced new anxieties. Instead of doing what my parents did, parents began to worry. Am I doing it right? Am I doing enough? Of course, many had no idea that there was so much to know about parenting. For those raised by parents who were caught in the fractures of the Industrial Revolution, their unmoored parents were the only model they had. The psychotherapy culture that emerged in the mid to late 20th century further emphasized introspection and emotional sensitivity. Again, these were necessary and valuable developments. But they also added pressure. Not only must you feed and clothe your child, but you must also attune to their inner world, monitor their psychological safety, and avoid any action that might cause trauma or lead to future mental health issues. And if you can't manage it, your child may need professional help in the form of psychotherapy. Meanwhile, consumerism and media began shaping parenting as well. Children became targeted as markets. Toys, screens, programs, and parenting products proliferated. Social comparison increased. The stakes felt higher. Success was now measured in terms of developmental milestones, emotional intelligence, academic achievement, and future competitiveness. Television also introduced a major cultural change. In addition to it being a platform for marketers of toys, provided childcare in terms of keeping children occupied. It also introduced them to the larger world. This was a good thing in many ways. Shows like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers provided not only entertainment, but education and some transmission of values and emotional intelligence. But it also became another way that parents and children no longer lived in the same world, even in the same household, and it paved the way for further developments in passive, disembodied living, later evolving into video games and social media. Along with public education, it contributed further to parents becoming increasingly out of the loop of their children's lives, unaware of what they were exposed to and learning, or how they were digesting it all. So let's review. Over several generations, parenting has been dislocated from its historical context, burdened with increasing responsibility, pathologized by a flood of expert opinion, pressured by impossible ideals, and stripped of its communal scaffolding. We now ask modern parents to raise children without inherited models, be their child's emotional anchor, teacher, and moral compass, do it largely alone and often while working full-time, compete with digital distractions and cultural noise, and somehow raise thriving, resilient children in a fragmented world. And if parents can't manage all of this, they're parenting failures, and the impact of their failure in terms of mental health issues and dysfunction is laid at their feet. Millions of hours of psychotherapy have been spent excavating all the things they did wrong or didn't do right. In short, we stripped away the village, the culture, the together time, and the help, and told parents to do it better than ever, or else. And this didn't happen overnight. The Industrial Revolution occurred over 300 years ago, and there have been approximately 30 generations born since then. The idea of the intergenerational transmission of trauma has increasingly become a common understanding. So, let's consider it in this historical context, to understand what we may consider to be the failure of our parents to provide what we needed as children. I think it is worth considering what they were contending with, not just the failures of their own parents, but a long, cumulative, multi-generational, and cultural process of fragmentation and change. Now I want to tell a story. Recently, I was working with a mother whose young son has serious behavioral issues. She doesn't know how to handle him. She told me she thought he needed a therapist. I paused and said gently, maybe he does, or maybe he just needs his mother. This wasn't meant to shame her. She's not alone. She's a product of a larger culture, a culture in which parenting has been increasingly outsourced to schools, to institutions, and now to therapy. We no longer raise children together organically as a community. We have professionalized everything. Everything becomes a service, an intervention, a treatment plan. The organic social fabric that once held families together is in tatters, and many parents are left trying to do the most important job in the world with almost no preparation, no help, and no script. My client had lost her faith in her own instincts and ability to provide what her son needed. I'm not saying that parents can do it all and that therapy is never necessary. This mother is in the very context I've been describing. I am saying, and I meant to communicate this to my client, that parents can make a profound difference in their children's lives if they can reconnect with their instincts and intuitions and not merely on the opinions of experts and professionals. They may need some guidance to get back on track and community support as well, but nature has provided us with natural wisdom. I suppose this is where I'm meant to offer concrete advice, some tiny list of things parents can do to navigate this impossible task. But honestly, I have no such thing to offer. It's not that there's nothing to say. It's because parenting doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in a cultural, economic, and technological context, and many of those forces are out of the parent's control. So maybe what I can offer instead, mainly, are not solutions, but some guiding principles, things to return to when the path isn't clear. I touched on this earlier, but I'll say it again. First, as developmental psychologist Robert Kegan put it, an ideal learning environment is an ingenious blend of support and challenge. Children need love, presence, and emotional safety, and they also need expectations. They need to be stretched toward independence and responsibility. Support without challenge creates fragility. Challenge without support breeds anxiety. But the right combination, held with care, builds strength. I think it's worth pointing out that support and challenge apply to our children's physical, emotional, and social needs, and that these change as they develop. They start out needing mostly support, and then increasingly degrees of challenge as they grow up. Too much or too little of either at the wrong developmental time can cause problems. That said, another important principle to keep in mind is what English pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott famously called the good enough mother. I think this applies to fathers too. The aim isn't to be perfect. And it's not just that we can't be perfect, it's that it's better if we don't try to be. What may seem like a parenting failure from the point of view of perfection often turns out to be just what our children need to grow. They need some degree of frustration and not having their needs immediately and perfectly met. This helps them to develop their inner resources and resilience. Beyond this, parents need support too. It should go without saying, but in the modern world, it is often lacking. Raising a child alone, physically, emotionally, existentially, is too much. It doesn't have to be a traditional mother-father pair. It can be any committed partnership, but it needs to be, at best, a partnership. And within a network of support, someone and some others to lean on when one of you is depleted, someone to reflect with, to help settle our frazzled nervous systems, to back us up when parenting stretches us beyond our limits, and an extended family or social network that not only supports us as parents, but takes an engaged interest in our children. Third, we need to rethink the village. I've gone to some length to describe what happens when the village is fragmented, commodified, or doesn't exist at all. What happens when community has been replaced by algorithms and shared values replaced by infinite individual preferences. I don't think we can go back, or should we go back, to some romanticized past, but we can ask, how can a community contribute to meeting my children's needs? And how do we begin rebuilding structures, formal or informal, that meet those needs? That might mean reclaiming extended family, or building intentional friendships among parents. It might mean multi-generational spaces where children see different stages of life modeled, or local community traditions that give rhythm and meaning to the year. It could be as simple as shared meals, mutual childcare, neighborhood mentoring. These aren't fixes for our fractured world, but they're not nothing, and they're not impossible. Fourth, we need to help children navigate a world of conflicting values. It's not enough, I don't think, to shelter them in a bubble of our own values, nor is it helpful to throw them into a sea of contradictory messages and expect them to figure it out on their own. Children need to be rooted in something, some story, some structure, some set of values that make sense of the world. But they also need to develop the tools to engage difference with curiosity, humility, and discernment. That doesn't happen by accident. It requires intention, and it requires adults who've done enough of that work themselves to model it in practice. Okay, maybe I'm sounding like another one of those experts proposing impossible tasks for parents. Fact is that we do live in a more complex world, and as parents, it is our job to prepare them for it, one way or the other. Parenting today is often an act of countercultural resistance. To parent well is to say no to disconnection, overstimulation, and isolation, and to say yes to something deeper. It means realigning ourselves with life telos, modeling patience, presence, and purpose, holding boundaries without fear of causing harm, and making a space for child to experience frustration, and preparing children not just to succeed in the system, but to preserve and develop the integrity of their own very life force. We may have lost the traditional village, but we can still rebuild its functions through conscious community, shared wisdom, and a deep remembering of what parenting is for. And it isn't just about raising our own children. It's also about stewarding the future of our species. Many parents are feeling overwhelmed and broken these days. It may be that you clicked on this video because that's how you feel. Maybe you're carrying damage, old injuries you didn't choose, inherited patterns you're still trying to understand. It doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. And it reflects a deeper truth. Parenting today isn't just a personal task, it's a task happening inside a fragmented, accelerated, and often contradictory world. There are cracks in the system, cracks that cause things to fall through and sometimes let harmful things in. This is not your fault, but all of it is real. You deserve compassion, not judgment, and maybe a clearer sense of what matters most and why. Because if we don't figure this out, there will be consequences, not abstract ones, real ones. We're already seeing rising rates of anxiety, depression, disconnection, meaninglessness, children raised without enough secure attachment, without grounded role models, without shared narratives or trusted elders, don't just struggle individually. Over time, these struggles become societal. They show up in mental health, social polarization, and the breakdown of the social fabric. So this matters, not just for parents and their children, but for all of us and for future generations. Each generation can pass on the trauma that has been passed on to them, or take stock and see about passing on something better, something more aligned with the deep needs of life. While I don't have a grand solution, I do believe that orientation matters. Returning to a framework like life telos, we can ask, what does life require to go on and to go well? This can give us a compass, even if we don't have a map. So maybe the way forward isn't one sweeping fix, but 1,000 small grounded gestures, a neighbor showing up, a grandparent stepping in, a parent getting enough sleep to listen instead of yell, a community center that becomes a second home, a teacher who sees a child not just for their performance, but who they're becoming. I want to close with a confession. If you haven't guessed it, I'm a boomer. Over the years, when reflecting on my own childhood, I came to realize that by today's standards, I was definitely neglected. My emotional needs were not recognized or met. I spent years feeling hurt and angry about this and healing from it, trying to. But I also had something many children today don't have, endless unstructured time to play. I spent long hours outside with friends, building forts, getting dirty, working out conflicts, inventing games. No adults intervened. It was messy, creative, and often dangerous, but it gave me something vital and life-affirming, and I cherish that now. I think it's what saved me from a worse fate. My local creek and woods and neighborhood friendships served as a surrogate mother and father to me. At the time, I didn't have the language to call it neglect, and my parents certainly didn't think of it that way. In fact, it's only because child development theory became mainstream during my lifetime that I was able to look back and reframe parts of my experience through that lens. On top of that, I failed to appreciate the larger picture, the historical events that had a multi-generational impact on my parents. Industrialization, urbanization, economic depression, 2 world wars, and more. These weren't just historical facts. They were forces that redefined family life, community structures, and emotional availability across generations. And my parents were not immune. As part of the boomer generation, I grew up with a new set of ideals, expectations for openness, affirmation, and attunement that my parents had never been taught and couldn't have modeled. We boomers wanted our parents to be both traditional providers and modern therapeutic nurturers. And when they couldn't meet that ideal, we often judged them harshly and blamed them for our troubles. It's only now, with hindsight, that I see how unrealistic some of our expectations were. Yes, emotional connection matters. I was indeed wounded. But with historical awareness, I can now see that parenting happens in context. And perhaps part of growing up, no matter how old we are, is learning to see that more clearly and take responsibility for our own healing. And just as earlier generations faced enormous cultural upheaval, we too are living through profound transformations. The rise of digital technology, artificial intelligence, a proliferation of genders and roles, changing economic pressures, and the erosion of shared Narratives are not just background noise, they shape the environment in which parenting happens today. Our own children may come to see our parenting as flawed and wounding based on things that we can't see yet. If previous generations struggled under the weight of massive change, we should expect the same of ourselves. The challenge is not just to survive these changes, but to reconnect to the essence of parenting, the support and challenge of our children, so that they can develop into whole adults ready to meet and navigate the world they will encounter. And we need to find ways to rebuild the necessary context for parenting, our communities, when we find ourselves isolated. Finally, I think this is of profound significance. Once upon a time, our ancestors knew what kind of world they were preparing their children for. At this point in history, we can't know what that world will be for our children. It's changing too rapidly. So I believe we need to anchor our parenting in the things that will always endure and that life will always require, no matter how much culture changes. Thanks for staying with me to the end. I hope this gave you some new perspectives on parenting. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other, and I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.